Hello and welcome everyone. This is the session titled Sustainable Living Your Way. And we are on a roll this week with the celebrations towards World Consumer Rights Day. This year's theme, which is a just transition for sustainable living, is really brought all of us together. And it's an exciting time where we are talking about one of the most important, challenge that our consumers across the globe are facing. On behalf of Consumers International, I welcome each one of you who have joined us today on this session, Sustainable Living Your Way. Consumers globally have been talking about and wanting to live more sustainably, more consciously towards the environment that they are in. But a lot of them need support, need more information, need more trust in the interventions that we are running. Today, this session with the stakeholders involved in the panel would be discussing how can we make sustainable living and bridge that gap between consumers and ourselves closer through interventions from policymakers and businesses. Before we begin, there are some housekeeping rules. First, there is interpretation available in French and Spanish. To activate this, you need to click on the button More and select Interpretation and choose the language in which you'd like to listen, either French or Spanish. Similarly, we've got closed captions for translations, and you can select the speaking language and the caption language to the language of your choice. When speaking, I would request all our speakers to please speak clearly and slowly for our interpreters, as well as for the captions to be read accurately. Ground rules, please note that this session will be recorded, and attendees, wherever you're joining from, we have shared our event code of conduct and you will need to adhere to it. We would love to hear or for you to share your thoughts. And so we have enabled Slido technology throughout all of our sessions. And I would request you to please keep your phone at hand and scan the Slido that I'm going to be sharing, where you can respond and share your thoughts. So without much ado, I want to request each one of you to please scan this below QR code where we have asked the question about how do you approach sustainable living? And we've got 4 different options, and you'd love to hear from the audience about how do you see or decide how you want to live sustainably. We will show the results of this poll later in the session and the discussion, but looking forward to hearing and seeing your responses. Moving on, I want to start off by introducing you to 4 individuals that we met almost 2 years ago when we did a survey across 30 countries. And we found that all of them had their own ways of living sustainably or approach sustainability in their own ways. Firstly, let's meet Adriana. Adriana is a woman who lives in the suburbs of Brazil. With her children, she's very conscious of environmental challenges and what kind of future she will leave for her children. She wants the government and the businesses to step up and address the climate change. And she prefers to be considerate about the kind of products she's purchasing on an everyday basis. Similarly, we've got Vishnu, who is living in urban India, and he is very interested in the latest products, styles, and technology. And he is willing to spend on the latest, newest technologies, be it electric vehicles or other cutting-edge technology that could support him to live more sustainably. We meet Antonio in Spain, who goes every day to work, has a routine-based lifestyle. He follows through all information that is being shared about sustainable living and wants to adhere to each one of them. And lastly, let's meet Emmanuel. Emmanuel is based out of Kenya, has just graduated, and he's worried about the environment. He tries to do a lot of different ways in which he can, address this challenge. It could be by conserving water or energy at home. He would be, buying not new phones, but maybe secondhand phones, because of the availability that he has. He wishes that the government could build better infrastructure to modernize his community. It could be solar panels, infrastructure being set in his community, while he can then, use it for his purposes. So there are different consumers that we met. And this is the discussion that we want to have. How do we meet consumers where they are and address the needs that they have to live more sustainably? A little more detail about what these consumers get inspired by, what would enable them and inform them. Each consumer that we met from these 4 different segments, who we named conscious consumers, seekers, supporters, and savers, had a very different lifestyle. If we look at conscious consumers, they were trying to do everything by the book that has been shared, including circular behaviors like recycling waste, avoiding single-use plastic, even saving on cooling and heating home. But when we look at their ways of commuting or buying secondhand items or renting items, we see that they do it the lowest. Interestingly, seekers who love new technologies, who like to try something new, they have been doing a lot of circular behaviors, including buying secondhand items or renting items instead of buying them, which was really interesting for us to observe. And similar to the conscious consumers, we found supporters to do a lot of different actions that was available to the public in general about sustainable lifestyles that would include turning off running water or recycling waste, but not other effortful actions towards sustainable lifestyles. And lastly, we had the savers who were using public transport or walking or riding a bicycle. They were trying to do as much as possible when it comes to adopting newer mobility lifestyles because of the availability of those kind of lifestyles for them. So we see that, different consumers, wherever they are, whatever motivations that they have, get inspired and also are informed very differently. Need for sustainability by design. When we looked a little deeper, we found that a lot of consumers at the savers and supporters end preferred to use the public transport, which is the most important or impactful sustainable lifestyle one could adopt in today's times. Whereas we found that the most motivated towards environment and climate change, they weren't using these mobility aspects or lifestyles in the day-to-day life. Similarly, if we look at buying secondhand, a lot of the consumers in general think that buying secondhand would have a large impact on protecting the environment. But we found that the most motivated for climate change and addressing them, that's the conscious consumers, weren't actually doing it similar to the others, except for the seekers who liked that lifestyle and to try new things. They were actually buying more secondhand products. When we look at the question of does new technology solve the problem of climate change, requiring only minor changes, we found that a lot of the different segments of consumers were agreeing with that fact, but it was the seekers and the savers who felt technology would be a problem solver for them. At the end of the research, we came up with a couple of key recommendations. Firstly, we need to personalize this entire approach of promoting sustainable lifestyles to consumers. We need to ensure that there is information transparency because trust is key when it comes to consumers. So we need to ensure that greenwashing and unclear labels are addressed. we need to look at decision nudging, where we talk about consumers being enabled to choose more sustainable options. And this needs to come from businesses and policies to make sustainable lifestyles more default and more convenient choice for the consumers. We also recommended that we need to have policy collaboration where we bring in different frameworks that encourages sustainable business models and also responsible consumption. And finally, we recommended business innovation, where we are looking at within the entire design and innovation of a product or service, we promote sustainable consumption over overconsumption and using the latest technologies to offer sustainability as different goals for consumers. At this point, I want to bring in my first speaker for this session, Jonathan Hall, who is the managing partner for Kantar Sustainable Transformation Practice. Jonathan, I've shared more from a qualitative perspective what we came up during our research, but it would be great if you could share what Kantar has been observing from your work. Over to you.
Thanks, Aayushi. Just trying to share my slides now. Okay, great. Thank you. So we're talking today about barriers, and I'm going to specifically zoom in on those barriers which are obviously from a consumer perspective rather than being the more broader systemic barriers that we'll be talking about later in the panel. And what business can do to respond to those particular barriers that people as consumers experience. So just starting off with a question that we're hearing a lot at the moment is, well, with all the turbulence in the world, is sustainability still important to people? And I think all of the data that we're seeing at the moment, despite all of that disruption in the different data sets, sustainability remains very much critical to people. And it remains personal, and the two are obviously deeply interrelated. Here's some data that says global data and around 3/4 around the world, saying that people like me need to fight, on the one hand, social inequality and justice, and the second, need to fight climate change. And we're not really seeing this move substantially. People's values are very deeply set, which in turn define their attitudes and their behaviors. Now, clearly, there are issues with regard to the cost of living crisis and so on, which do shift things in the shorter term. But what we see is the trend lines are clear and a greater shift overall towards a sense of mutualism within society. This is particularly true of younger cohorts. So the data I'm looking at here is two statements. One, I consider myself an environmentalist, and second is about buying sustainable products and services. Is a reflection of who I am. So it's in effect about social identity. And what we see is that the two generations that pop are Gen Z and millennials in particular. And if we broke that down even further, it would be the late millennials who are really driving this broader societal value shift, and they're pulling Gen Z on behind them. And, you know, this will become more and more important over time as those younger cohorts start to experience the sort of transfer of wealth that we're expecting with, in the US alone, transfer of wealth of $84.4 trillion from boomers to those two segments. So they'll be able to start to follow through on their values and beliefs. Now, to this very point, the value action gap is something which probably we're all familiar with. Some people call it the say-do gap. It's the gap between people's stated values and beliefs and the actions that they take. And a consumer perspective, obviously, that's purchasing behaviors. Something which has been around in the academic literature for a couple of decades, but it remains doggedly broad in terms of that gap. So what we see here, 85% of people across the world saying they want to make more sustainable choices, but only 29% are actively changing their behavior. And we've refined our questioning methods to actually really try and narrow down any potential virtue signaling or overclaim. But nevertheless, of course, some people will wrinkle our noses and say, well, isn't that the case? There's a bit of overclaim there. And of course, there will be. However, what we also observe from this and other data sets is that actually, you know, people do experience very real barriers to living the sustainable lifestyles that they want to. And those are to do with price and convenience and accessibility, performance and quality, and so forth. Despite that, 88% of people say that they're looking for brands and businesses to help them live a more sustainable lifestyle. Now, one of the barriers that we experience, of course, here is that we're living in a post-truth world, a world of hyper-cynicism fueled by social media and various vested interests. 68% here that we see on this chart worry about brands being involved in social and environmental issues just for commercial reasons. And 56% remarkably saying that they've seen false or misleading data or evidence about sustainability, sustainable actions taken by brands. Now, that is across all categories and sectors, so it varies slightly, and it varies slightly across the world, but it's broadly around that number, which is a remarkable number and really quite worrying in terms of the trust erosion that businesses have been experiencing. So significant barriers. And how do we start to overcome some of these? Well, there are many ways, of course, and we'll come into these in the discussion, but here's one of them. So when we look at that, the value action gap, which is such a source of consternation for a lot of businesses, what we find is that there are some really easily identifiable frictions or barriers that can be addressed by businesses. Now, but you do need to look at this on a sector or category basis because they do move around. So what we're looking at here is the apparel and footwear sector. And, you know, there are issues that people experience around price and expense, which is pretty consistent across sectors. There are also things around lack of knowledge and information, the asymmetry of information that people experience. People feel that it requires extra effort on their part. It's hard work for them. Businesses aren't making it easier. And then they're also feeding back that they've experienced issues of quality or performance or experience. So, you know, these are things that many individuals are not prepared to compromise on. If they buy a product, a hair care product or a consumer tech product, they expect that to deliver the same level of experience as a non-sustainable oriented product. And then finally, there's a powerful brand issue here that, you know, not enough mainstream brands are offering these sorts of products and services. But these are very identifiable issues that businesses and brands can really target in order to help people live the sustainable lifestyles that they want to lead, as we've seen, that are looking for brands to help them with, and therefore close that value action gap and realize the massive commercial opportunity that exists in that gap. Aayushi.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And if we can also now bring in Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive Officer from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I wanted to actually, you know, at this point where, you know, Jonathan's identified these frictions that are there, I wanted to ask both of you about how can we ensure that businesses and policymakers try to make the green the default choice for consumers? How do we do that? And I could start with Lindsay first. Lindsay, welcome to the panel, and would love to know your thoughts on this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I should say that the insights that I will share will draw on our work, particularly in Europe. We produce some work around called Context is Everything, which is really looking at not just the willingness, but the ability of consumers to be able to make more sustainable choices. And I think really building on the data and the insights that we've just heard, there is a real challenge within businesses that, frankly, many business models at the moment are dependent on unsustainable practices. It is more profitable to make money from activities that speaking frankly, trash the planet rather than protect it. We've heard that customers don't want to and don't expect to have to pay a premium. And so those businesses, and many do, that would really love to be innovating and meeting customer needs, are between a rock and a hard place. Those that would like to act, it often is more expensive, not always, but often it is. And if you're taking on additional costs voluntarily that then consumers won't pay for, or your investors won't swallow, you're in a really tough place. So it's really hard in many cases to take on those additional costs if the market won't bear it. We need to change the rules of the game to really incentivize it. There's also a really interesting piece there around consumers not wanting businesses to profit and a lack of trust if businesses do profit. But for it to be commercially sustainable, businesses need a viable business model. They will need to be able to turn a profit. So there's clearly a tension there that if this is going to be good business, it has to deliver for business too. I think there's also that challenge around that consumers really don't want to compromise lifestyles, and nobody's telling them that that's the thing they may have to do. Until we can, say, fully decarbonize aviation, it is unsustainable to have the level of international flights that we have. So I think there's a need also for a level of awareness and honesty about some of this. And then if we look at the government end of this nexus of the different actors, many governments and economies are dependent on more consumption in order to make the numbers work at an economic level. Governments fear being labelled anti-growth or nanny state if they intervene. So I think all of the different actors have, challenges and are locked in, but that can't be a reason not to act. So very briefly, where do the solutions lie? I think firstly, having a clear long-term, and that long-term piece is really important, and shared, joined up vision for what are we trying to get to? What would better look like? Businesses can't develop business models and innovate. Investors can't put money behind solutions if they don't have confidence that there's going to be a long-term market. So there's a need for that level of clarity and joined up thinking. A need for joined up incentives. In the places where we've seen some of the biggest positive shifts, we've seen a combination of factors. We've seen subsidies and infrastructure investment and great communications that all add up together and work together in supportive shifts. But I think that we have to not rely on voluntary action by business. We need incentives and we need mandates from governments to remove that competitive disadvantage, to just make it a requirement, because then businesses can get on and do it. They know that they aren't going to be penalized by early mover because all their competitors are also going to have to move. So then it becomes a competitive imperative. You're performing better on sustainability performance. And just where it fails often is where there are big bottlenecks, like there are not all of the skills needed or the workforce that are needed in order to deliver what's needed. Or, for instance, at domestic levels, there are delays in energy inspections and audits that are required, or it's just too complex, or it's not well explained. So a whole lot of those practical factors that get in the way, even if you've got the incentives all laid out and people are willing to engage.
Thanks, Lindsay. And there's a lot to unravel and unpack here, where you've spoken about, long-term solutions and building that confidence for businesses, and also addressing the capacity gap as well. Jonathan, in your opinion, what is it that businesses need to do and policymakers need to do to make green the default choice?
Oh, well, I'll focus more on businesses, Aayushi. I think Lindsay's obviously talked there from a policy point of view. I mean, I think businesses, needless to say, are just looking for a level playing field that they can plan their business on. And that's what they've been, lacking over a period of several years, both at a domestic and an international level. And clearly, it doesn't seem that we're in for much consistency right now. However, from a business perspective to date, we've seen they've been doing a poor job, as some of the data that I've just shared demonstrates. And I think the unlock for me comes in really the definition of organizational purpose that we see in the work of people like Colin Mayer at Side Business School at Oxford, and the way he frames it as being to solve society's problems profitably. And to Lindsay's point, obviously businesses will need to make a profit. So that does need to be addressed. But the other key point that I suppose I'd like to focus on is to solve society's problems, because from a consumer angle, we've seen through the value action gap data that there are some problems or barriers or frictions, however you want to articulate that, which people feel very keenly. And there's an opportunity there. Indeed, there's an open invitation there for businesses to use their brands to really start to solve those problems. So I think we have that definition of what those barriers are. There's a huge commercial opportunity to do that, and therefore I think solving those problems profitably is really well within the business's grasp and should be their focus. And then I think it's driving into the tools at their disposal in areas of activation, as it were, like communications, where they should be thinking about how they design communications to normalize sustainable lifestyles. So, to make it to put it very simply, if we're seeing advertising, then those storylines which they use in advertising executions, be they central or incidental to the narrative, are actually, really, normalizing those lifestyles rather than making them seem peripheral, fringe, or freaky in some way. So I think that would be the other aspect I'd draw attention to.
Amazing. And this kind of brings me, to the three challenges that we saw when we did our research as well around accessibility, affordability, and awareness amongst consumers. That's basically what's needed. And I want to bring in Professor Chiso Ndukwe-Okafor, who is the Executive Director for Consumer Advocacy and Empowerment Foundation, Nigeria. And I want to bring in Sarah Enright as well, Senior Director, Safety and Sustainability, Consumer Reports, US. Sarah, I would start off with you first about, how can we embed, consumer rights in this just transition? How do we address these gaps that consumers are experiencing with sustainable living? Sarah, we having some tech issues. We can't hear you. Sorry.
Sure. Is this okay now?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having us. And, I think that we agree very strongly with the premise of this panel that consumers really should not have to face a moral dilemma every time they make a purchasing decision. Essential products and services really should be designed by default sustainably, affordably, and inclusively. I guess we're all here today because we know that we're really far from this ideal. And perhaps getting even further away during a time when environmental regulations are being challenged, companies are backstepping on their sustainability commitments, and consumers are being inundated with misinformation about sustainability. So we at Consumer Reports anticipate that it is going to be harder than ever for consumers to figure out how to make the best choice for themselves or their families, no matter where they lie on their spectrum of interest in sustainable lifestyles. One of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we help consumers to reduce this decision-making fatigue? And through our core service, we help to serve consumers by doing independent product evaluations and ratings. We hope to help make it easier for them to make the purchasing decision that's best for themselves, their families, and their pocketbooks. We're adding in another layer through our Green Choice program, which we started several years ago, evaluating the sustainability features of cars. We're expanding that to include the majority of product lines that Consumer Reports reviews, so that we are able to offer consumers a single indicator that helps them determine whether some of the largest purchases they make in their lifetime are better for the environment than their peers across that product line. So we're trying really to work on simplifying those decision-making factors so that consumers can live their good life and make sustainable decisions without having to go as deeply as we're asking them to on each purchase that they make. That said, we know also that individual purchasing decisions, it doesn't necessarily add up to, a more sustainable economy, and that there needs to be systemic solutions to address more sustainable economies. So we also help to raise consumer voice, to advocate directly to policymakers and to corporations to demand that there be better practices and policies that lead to a more sustainable economy. And that, I think, is that kind of both affecting consumer decision-making as well as policy and corporate practice is all necessary for consumers to really experience a more sustainable system.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So it kind of helps us understand that, we're giving that agency to the consumers to make the right decisions based on, the tools that you've mentioned. Professor Chiso, you've been working really hard in Nigeria as well to promote this just transition. How do you see embedding consumer rights in this movement for consumers?
Like the last speaker said, it's really a place of education and awareness. When it comes to sustainable consumption, it doesn't matter how much policies you put in place. It does not matter what is going on in your own sphere, and if there is not education and awareness backed with honesty. Because yes, the issue of affordability is a big issue that a lot of people, when Jonathan spoke, he spoke about the value action gap, what people value and what they do. And a lot of times, if you tweak it, from my experience, if you tweak it down, it's like, I don't trust what they're saying, or I don't understand what they're talking about. So, or it is for the rich people. Sustainability is for those, it's affordability thing. So it all comes back down to education and awareness at every level, both for the policymakers to bring understanding, so that even if you're embedding it into the system, the policymakers need to really understand, and not just understand what it is, but understand the affordability. Is it going to be affordable? So if it's not, what other things can I embed in the policy? Like Sarah said, things about incentives and mandates have to be considered from the policy perspective, while the awareness is not just, I see consumers as everybody, including the policymakers. And so, so for me, education and awareness at every level, because if you understand what you're making policies and how it's going to impact your constituency, then it pushes you back over to the say, okay, I'm making this policy, but I'm going to have mandates. I'm going to include incentives, so that the space between value and action is narrowed. Right now, it's a very wide gap. And I think in developing countries, it's a much wider gap because of the case of affordability. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Professor Chiso. I want to actually, go back to Sarah, and we've been talking about incentives, mandates, different ways of financial mechanisms that can make sustainable products and services more accessible. How do you see, approaching these financial mechanisms for different consumers? Because every consumer family is experiencing, household is experiencing something different. How do we address this using financial mechanisms?
Thanks for that. I think we are asking for quite a bit, right? A clean energy and circular economy revolution. And that does require innovation and investment across all sectors and governments. We want products and services that do less harm to the environment. That will take money to develop and particularly to scale. In practice and in the United States, we're really just asking our government to continue supporting manufacturer and consumer incentives, the grants and subsidies and tax credits that have been made available in recent years. We'd love to see those continue to be available to consumers. We see that helps to drive demand, it helps to raise awareness, it helps to make new products and services more affordable, and it incentivizes manufacturers to create higher quality, low energy products and services. And we'd love to see those continue to be available over the coming years to help drive the energy transition. For consumers, I think that are finding the premium that is placed on more sustainable products to be difficult to afford. We'd love to see more innovative financial products be made available, such as pay-as-you-go plans that enable consumers to purchase an expensive product, but then those products tend to earn their value back in time through savings on utility bills, so they'll be able to afford to pay for it over time as they're using the product. So I think more leaning in to supporting and not really seeing it as a subsidy so much as an investment in a sustainable economy.
Amazing. Yes, looking at it more from investment rather than, subsidy. That's an interesting point. And I want to bring in Lindsay again in this discussion. Lindsay, what do you think about these? Like you've mentioned about incentives and mandates when you were, opening the discussion. What are these financial mechanisms and how can they address the different needs of consumers to live sustainably?
So I want to start by agreeing with Sarah that actually, if we're looking at economy-wide shift, which we need to be looking at comprehensive and complementary sets of policies that will really drive the innovation and then rely on markets to then tilt. And there's increasing and growing bodies of evidence about which combinations work best and what kinds of interventions work best. And broadly speaking, I think both at the level of broad economies and at consumers, I think there's evidence that positive incentives tend to be more effective than punishment or disincentives. So I think that applies. But if we look specifically at consumers, I think obviously looking both at the capital cost and the cost of any if it's a new technology purchase as well as the operating cost, I think that's obvious. And looking at incentives that relate to both, I think it's also clear that although we need systemic change, being really targeted about which groups and also empowering at local levels what are going to be the most effective interventions and enabling, whether it's at state or regional. In the UK, it would be county levels, to be looking at where to direct incentives or other financial mechanisms to deliver things that are really relevant to the local context. Then if we look at beyond that in targeting, looking at where are those decision points when people are anyway thinking about a change. So what are those moments of change? Typically a new house, a new car purchase, it could be a new job, and they're looking at new commuting patterns. So targeting at a regional level, but also targeting at decision points. And then when we come on to the package of mechanisms, there are those direct subsidies and tax incentives for upfront and operating costs. So I think in Norway, there were incentives or subsidies around the purchase of electric vehicles. And then there were ongoing, so reductions in road tolls or parking exemptions. So I think there are a range of ongoing incentives. I think a level of predictability and certainty about if it's, say, in the building sector, the kind of feed-in tariffs or the subsidies, short-term incentives that, or that move quickly, that people either miss out on or the game has changed around them and they don't get the guaranteed returns, just erodes trust and confidence. There are other innovations. I think in Sweden, there was a reduction in VAT, which incentivized people to repair products more because it was just financially attractive. And I think where there's local resistance, say to onshore wind farms, innovations that give people a financial interest, allow them to invest in it, can remove some of that resistance if they can see they're directly financial beneficiaries of those investments. Disincentives like congestion charging are effective, can be effective, get a lot of resistance, particularly where there's a lot of income inequality, and also where there are not yet accessible and safe alternatives. So I think that's really important there. I think there are opportunities to make it default in pensions and savings and where those funds are being invested in renewable energy provision. So I think flipping some of the defaults in some places, but I think recognizing that there's the willingness that we've seen, or the interest, which might is not full willingness, but there's an interest and an appetite. There are financial incentives, but as in my earlier response, looking also at those practical pieces, is there institutional and infrastructure support in place? Is there access to information, as we've just heard? Is it being, communicated well? Is it simple and clear? Yeah, and is it safe? Often, if we're asking people to say use public transport, particularly speaking as a woman, am I confident that I will be safe traveling by alternative measures? Really matters in the choices that I would make.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and something that we also came up in our research when we asked consumers why aren't they using public transport. They mentioned two things. One is lack of reliability of those services, and the second one being safety. And this was across countries where we interviewed. So yes, completely agree with you on that, Lindsay. I want to, stick with you on the point of technology and innovation. There's a lot of work, and people are talking about technology being, magic wand to get consumers to live more sustainably. What do you think about the innovation and technology, and how can it create convenience for consumers who are thinking about cost and style when it comes to sustainable living? What do you think about that?
So broadly, I think that a lot of the challenges we face could be addressed through technology at a macro level if we had level playing fields for a lot of those to compete and address some of the subsidies. So I think there's a huge amount we could collectively achieve that we wouldn't then be relying on consumer action. But you're asking me specifically about technology in relation to consumers. So I think there are, I suppose, three areas. Using technology to automate, to address some of those defaults, to nudge some of the decision architecture at the point when people are making choices. So using some of that combination of behavioral economics and technology at the interface of consumer decision making, I think can be helpful. A second one then is for those that want to take action and say manage their their household shopping, their food, their holiday planning, their financial management tools. And we heard that it's just too hard. There are too many steps, and what is a good aspiration ends up not happening. So tools, apps that enable it to be as smooth and quick as possible for people to make sure their decisions align with their values and aspirations. And that give them access, say, to if people want to buy secondhand clothes but they don't fit, how can they quickly get them altered so they will fit, so they get something that works for them. Access to trusted suppliers. So there are a whole range of ways of connecting people to products and services that will give a level of trust. And then a really important piece is making it aspirational, making it absolutely deliver superior performance. And Tesla's it was on aspiration and superior performance that it was predominantly sold in the first place. And I think that's also around advertising, not just the tech. How is it being positioned, not just as a save the planet and a values case, but being positioned as a really aspirational product as well. But I think back to the point about aviation, until we have some of those big shifts in how we're fueling economies, I think we have to be honest about the tech at the consumer level alone will not deliver the changes the scale we need, as we've heard from other speakers.
Yeah, got it. Make it aspirational and also look at the quality of these kind of products and services. I want to bring in Jonathan as well. On this very question, you've looked at the friction, but do you see technology and innovation as a way to drive behavior change amongst consumers?
No, absolutely. I think it's one of the innovations, one of the key levers, innovation communications that businesses have using their brands as vehicles to help people live the lifestyles that they want to. And I've talked about how you can really, in a granular way, understand what those frictions or barriers are on a sector by sector basis, which, by the way, is the only way to do it, because otherwise I think you're going to get it wrong and people will start to think you are inauthentic and think that you're greenwashing. And I think innovation needs to happen at both an incremental and a more radical level. So it needs to be, built into the value chain, that those behaviors are being addressed, those particular frictions, but then also, that businesses are thinking about reorientating business models in order to be able to better fulfill those consumer needs and address those barriers. What I would say is, and this builds a bit on what Lindsay was just saying, is that I think we need to accept that rare is the consumer for whom sustainability alone is the key purchase driver. You know, products and services need to deliver, and be that quality or price or convenience or performance. And so I think businesses have to get better at understanding the role that sustainability plays in that list of priorities and in the architecture of decision making. So for example, I think we've seen many examples of mistakes being made where the sustainability component of a proposition is really foregrounded. So the water quality of a beer, for example, or the natural ingredients of a beauty product. I think what we need to move to is a communication and education to people of understanding why the natural ingredients of the beauty product actually make that a better beauty product, why the water purity makes that beer a better tasting beer. I think that's really, really critical. And then just to come back to your point about, those really hard issues around convenience and cost. I mean, I think there are real people who will have come up in your segmentation as well, Aayushi, who are dismissers of these issues, who don't want to engage. But we can also understand, what their particular drivers are. They're often cost related. There's often skepticism with regards to, quotes, a woke agenda. But I think we can frame propositions in terms that will appeal to them. And so the innovation work through the value chain, if it's actually affecting, for example, cost savings and efficiencies, which can be passed on to the consumer, well, that can be a win for even the most skeptical consumer. Now, it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to be communicating that these cost savings have been derived through sustainable measures in the value chain. It's just they can benefit from that particular work. Aayushi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. So yeah, like making innovation technology work incrementally through the value chain. That sounds really interesting point. And I now want to bring all of you in on this one question about how do we strengthen accountability mechanisms. So there is so much that policymakers and businesses say that they're working towards sustainable living or promoting it. How do we build accountability measures to ensure that what is being shared, the commitments that are being made are being held up? So I want to start off with Professor Chiso first. How do we strengthen these accountability mechanisms?
It's really interesting, some of the things that Jonathan spoke about incremental. But when it comes to accountability measures, I believe there should be some mandatory reporting. Not only just the government should require businesses to do mandatory reporting, because it should be it should compel the businesses, because either there'll be an incentive built into it. So mandatory reporting. Another thing is that they can be independent regulatory oversight. I can see where not necessarily the government itself stepping in to be the regulatory oversight, but the businesses itself, or the consumer agencies, associations. So there can be independent regulatory oversights that to make sure, in terms of transparency and honesty. So to make sure that what they're saying they're doing is truly what they're doing. There should be consumer-led accountability also. I believe strongly that if consumers begin to rate and overview, Consumer Reports does a good job of looking at different products and evaluating them. So there could be consumer-led accountability by allowing consumers to rate and review businesses based on their sustainability practices. And this will also encourage transparency and advocacy. The other part is that the role that the government could play is commitments and enforcements. If governments get committed and there is enforcement, because I know enforcement regulations, sometimes it's haphazard. It's not consistent. So establishing legally binding, sustainable targets and ensuring that strict enforcement is that will drive the meaningful changes put in place. That's and then when they're non-compliance, there should be legal action. So compliance that is backed by legal action will help. And not just from the government, but even consumer-led organizations, if they are empowered to take legal action against those affected, those communities that are affected, then it would help. And finally, what I see is a stakeholders engagement and make it a participatory activity, not the government sitting in one place and deriving all these policies and then coming to tell everybody this is what's going to be, but a multi-level stakeholder engagement where everybody is involved, from the businesses to the consumers to the regulators, as well as those that are among the researchers. So a multi-stakeholder engagement governance, not just in creating policies, but in monitoring it. Well, those models will help everyone involved. Aayushi?
Yeah, those are some really interesting points and, things that we as consumer advocates also need to look at. How do we strengthen these points further globally through our network? So thank you so much, Professor Chiso, for that. Lindsay, what do you think? Like, how do we build accountability mechanisms in this area?
So I would completely agree with all of that. What would I add? I would add absolutely the need for consequences, not just disclosure. I think in Europe we've had a lot of pushback because we've had a lot of mandatory disclosures, but without there being any incentives or penalties in a way. And we're not going to simply disclose our way to a sustainable economy. We need to have a kind of a so what. There'll be an incentive or there'll be a penalty. So I think otherwise we're just relying on voluntary action, and that only works when there's positive market sentiment. I would also say that we need to have strong universities and research who can point to where the challenges are. We need confidence in the rule of law. We need independent media to bring transparency. And I think there are places where those are under attack or not strong. So we need the foundations to have confidence in markets and evidence in order to be able to hold organizations accountable. Your question was not just about holding businesses accountable, also about holding governments accountable. And clearly where governments have made legally binding commitments, we can use, as Client Earth do and others do, using the rule of law in order to hold governments accountable for legal commitments that they've made. Where they don't have legal commitments, then I think it's back into some of the territory that Jonathan was talking about the need to better communicate both to individuals as consumers and also as citizens, to make clear to them why action is in their interest, why they suffer through inaction, so they aren't only hearing from those in whose interest it is to resist action, but they're better able to understand why they should be using their purchasing power, their votes, their voices, to hold governments to accountable, to deliver for them and deliver for their children and for their community. So I think much stronger empowerment of citizens and consumers in their own interests, I think, will be needed to really put this on political agendas. Until politicians think it's going to matter in votes or it's going to matter from business support, it's hard to get this as a top agenda item.
Amazing. That's really important. And I think it's a great takeaway for us, Lindsay, about empowering the consumers and the citizens because they have the purchasing power. So yeah, completely, take a note of that. Jonathan, what do you think about, building accountability? We are almost at the hour. So just wanted to ensure we wrap up. So if in 20 to 30 seconds, you can let us know, how do we build accountability mechanisms?
I mean, the only build I'd make is thinking about who we're talking about, consumers, I think the marketing function within businesses is absolutely critical here. And I think to date, there's not been enough focus on that discipline, either in terms of building their education knowledge or of hardwiring accountability into their KPIs and their personal objectives. So I would say that should be a focus with regard to consumers.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Sarah, like, how do you see that, how is Consumer Reports looking at this from your end?
Thank you. Well, I'll just add one extra lens to this is I think that we also need to make sure that for truly a just transition, that we right size the asks of consumers, right? They're not lower income consumers should be asked to make less lifestyle adjustments than millionaires and billionaires. So let's focus our attention on the people who have the resources to make deep transitions in their own lifestyles. In addition to calling on governments and corporations to change their practices.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We are at the hour, and just for the audience to know, when we ran the poll, we got the results, and it seems like ease of adopting sustainable lifestyles came up as like the most important approach for anyone to adopt sustainable lifestyles in the room, at least. But we look forward to having these discussions further throughout the week, and hope to see you at the hour at our next session on sustainable diets. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And Jonathan, Lindsay, Professor Chiso, and Sarah, thank you so much for enlightening the audience. Until the next time, take care.